Dust from the shuttle engines still clung to Warren Doyle's boots when the guards pushed him into the Grand Hall of Solvang. He had not asked to be there. His cargo hauler had blown a coil 20 minutes from the capital, and the Port Authority, desperate to fill the visitor seats for the ceremony's hollow broadcast, had grabbed anyone standing nearby with a valid identity chip. Warren had tried to explain that he was just a farmer hauling grain crates back to his colony lease, but nobody had listened. Now he sat in the fourth row of a hall built for kings, wearing a stained work jacket among nobles dripping in ceremonial silver. The hall itself seemed to breathe. Massive stone pillars rose into a domed ceiling painted with the history of the Draconian Empire, scenes of ancient dragons soaring beside their first riders. Thousands of imperial citizens filled the tiers above, and in the center of it all sat a wide sand pit, warmed by hidden heating coils, waiting for the clutch of eggs resting at its heart. Warren had heard of the hatching ceremony the way most outsiders had, as a legend told in passing. Once every 100 years, a new generation of star dragons broke free of their shells and bonded for life with a rider chosen not by decree, but by the hatchling itself. It was said the bond could never be forced and never be broken, a rare piece of freedom in an empire built on rank and bloodline. Trumpets sounded, and the champions entered. They came in a slow procession, 7 of the empire's finest riders, each one a legend in their own right. Their armor gleamed with the burned scars of old wars, badges of honor stitched into their capes. The crowd rose to its feet, chanting names Warren did not know, throwing flowers that caught in the hot arena air. These were not soldiers chosen for show. They were killers who had tamed war dragons in real battle, bred for generations to carry the bloodline of command. The eggs began to crack. One by one, smaller hatchlings emerged from the outer nests, stumbling on wet limbs, and one by one they crawled toward the champions as tradition demanded. The crowd roared each time a bond formed, blue light flashing between rider and dragon, a mark burned gently into both their skin. It was beautiful, practiced, exactly as it always had been for 1,000 years. Then the largest nest at the center of the pit began to move. This was the nest everyone had come to see, 6 eggs marked with gold dust, said to carry the blood of the Empire's very first dragons, a bloodline thought nearly extinct. When the shells split open, the hatchlings inside were different from the rest, larger, their scales shimmering faintly even in the dim light, their eyes far too aware for creatures only minutes old. The 7 champions stepped forward together, each one certain the ancient bloodline was meant for them. The hatchlings recoiled. At first the crowd thought it was nerves, newborn creatures overwhelmed by noise and light. But as each champion knelt and reached out a gloved hand, the hatchlings hissed, backing away, pressing against each other in a tight, frightened cluster. One of the champions, a broad-shouldered woman with 3 war medals on her chest, tried to force the bonding ritual, gripping the nearest hatchling by the neck. It screamed. The sound cut through the hall like a blade, sharp and raw, and every hatchling in the nest screamed with it, thrashing against the sand. Guards rushed forward. Priests of the ceremonial order shouted for calm. The champions backed away, confused and humiliated in front of the entire empire, their reputations built over decades unraveling in seconds. And then the hatchlings began to move. Not toward another champion, not toward a noble in the crowd. They crawled straight across the sand pit, past the shocked officials, past the guards who did not know whether to stop 6 sacred creatures from the Empire's most prized bloodline, and climbed the low barriers separating the pit from the seats. They stopped in front of Warren. He froze. 6 pairs of golden eyes stared up at him, small chests heaving, and before he could stand or step back, the largest hatchling pressed its head against his knee and let out a soft, satisfied chirp. The others followed, crowding around his boots, nuzzling his hands, one of them climbing halfway into his lap despite its size. The hall went completely silent. Warren looked around at thousands of stunned faces, at guards with hands frozen on their weapons, at priests staring in open disbelief, at the 7 humiliated champions standing empty-handed in the center of the arena. He looked down at the small creature, now chewing gently on his sleeve, its scales warm against his skin. "I think there's been some kind of mistake," he said quietly, though no one was close enough to hear him over the rising murmur of the crowd. A priest of the ceremonial order stepped forward on shaking legs, staring not at Warren, but at the hatchlings surrounding him with open reverence. He raised a trembling hand toward the crowd, and the murmuring died instantly. "The bloodline has chosen," the priest said, his voice barely above a whisper, yet somehow carrying to every corner of the silent hall. "It has chosen him. Warren Doyle, farmer, hauler of grain, owner of nothing more impressive than a leased plot of land and a cargo shuttle held together with spare parts, looked down at 6 dragons that refused to leave his side, and understood that his simple life had just ended. By the time the sun set over Solvane, Warren had been moved through 4 different rooms, each one colder and more official than the last. He sat now in a windowless chamber deep beneath the Imperial Palace, a metal table between him and 3 officials who had not stopped arguing since he arrived. The 6 hatchlings lay curled in a pile against the wall behind him, refusing to be more than a few feet from his side. "We simply relocate them," said the shortest official, a thin man with a datapad clutched to his chest. "Standard procedure. The bond can be reassigned through proper channels." "There is no proper channel," snapped the woman beside him, older, dressed in the deep red robes of the ceremonial order. "The bond is not a title. It is not a contract. It is written into the blood of the creature the moment it forms. Break it, and you kill them. All 6. The room fell quiet except for the soft breathing of the hatchlings. Warren had tried twice already to explain that he had not asked for any of this, that he was supposed to be halfway back to his colony by now with a hold full of grain crates, not sitting in an imperial basement while strangers debated the fate of 6 baby dragons who kept using his boots as pillows. Nobody in the room seemed interested in what he had to say. Earlier, when a squad of guards had tried to physically separate him from the hatchlings, moving him to a different transport for processing, the results had been immediate and violent. The moment guards pulled Warren toward the door, the hatchlings had thrown themselves against the bars of their holding pen, screeching, one of them biting clean through a guard's glove hard enough to draw blood. Another had slammed its small body against the wall over and over, leaving a smear of blood on the stone before anyone managed to stop it. The guards had backed off fast after that, and the ceremonial order had ordered Warren returned to the hatchlings immediately. "It's simple," the thin official continued, tapping his datapad. "We remove the source of the distress permanently, and the bloodline problem resolves itself." "You are talking about killing him," the woman in red said flatly, "in front of 6 dragons who would tear this palace apart trying to stop you, and in front of a public that watched the entire ceremony live. Do you understand what that would do to the Empire's standing?" The thin man went quiet. A new voice entered the room, calm and even. "There may be a simpler solution." Warren turned to see a tall officer step through the door, dressed in the gray and gold of Imperial Military Command, her posture rigid, her expression unreadable. She introduced herself briefly as Colonel Reyes Okafor, assigned by the Emperor's own office to oversee what she called the bloodline situation. "He trains as a writer," Okafor said, nodding toward Warren, "under Imperial law and Imperial supervision. If he fails the trials, the matter resolves itself without anyone needing to explain a dead farmer to the public." The woman in red considered this, then nodded slowly. "The order accepts these terms. There is precedent buried deep in the old records, precedent none of you have likely read. A prophecy, spoken long before the current dynasty, of a low-born hand awakening the eldest bloodline. Many dismissed it as superstition." She looked at Warren with something between suspicion and curiosity. Perhaps it was not superstition. Warren felt every eye in the room turn to him. "I have a farm," he said, aware of how small his voice sounded in the stone chamber. "I have crops in the ground right now that need tending, and a colony depending on that grain shipment. I don't know the first thing about riding a dragon, let alone 6 of them." "Then you have a choice," Okafor said, not unkindly, but without room for argument. "Train and keep them alive. Refuse and be tried for theft of Imperial property, since legally, until the trials are complete, the hatchlings remain classified as Imperial assets." She paused. "I would also remind you that removing you from their presence has already resulted in 2 injuries tonight. I doubt the Emperor wants that repeated in a public execution." Warren looked back at the hatchlings, now stirring awake, small heads lifting to watch him with those unervingly aware golden eyes. One of them, the largest of the six, unfolded itself from the pile and crossed the room to press its head against his leg again, chirping softly, as if sensing the tension. He thought of his fields back home, of the quiet mornings feeding livestock before dawn, of a life built on patience and simple routines. He thought of his sister, who managed the farm's books and would be furious he had not called. He thought of 6 creatures who, for reasons no one in this room understood, had chosen him over 7 of the Empire's greatest heroes. Fine, Warren said finally, rubbing a hand over his tired face. I'll train, but I do this my way, not the Empire's way. If any of your instructors try to hurt them to make a point, I'm gone, consequences or not. Okafor studied him for a long moment, something unreadable passing behind her eyes. Understood, she said simply. Report to the Academy grounds at first light. I will be your supervising officer. As the room emptied and the officials filed out still arguing quietly among themselves, Warren sat alone with 6 dragons pressing close around him and allowed himself, just for a moment, to wonder exactly what kind of trouble he had wandered into. The Academy grounds smelled like nothing Warren had known on his farm, all scorched metal and polished stone, with none of the soft dirt and green smell he was used to waking up to. He stood at the edge of the training yard just after dawn, watching noble-born cadets stretch and warm up in perfect synchronized lines, their movements sharp and rehearsed. Beside him, his 6 hatchlings shuffled restlessly, unsettled by the unfamiliar ground beneath their claws. A cadet nearby, tall and pale with an insignia marking him from one of the Empire's oldest houses, elbowed his friend and nodded toward Warren. That's him, the one from the ceremony. The farmer, the friend said, not bothering to lower his voice. Explains why they picked him. Dumb animals following whoever smells the most like dirt. Laughter rippled through the yard. Warren said nothing, keeping his eyes on the hatchlings instead, who had gone very still, watching the cadets with something close to suspicion. The head instructor, a scarred man named Barrick with a voice built for shouting across battlefields, called the yard to order and began the morning drills. Warren quickly learned the Academy's method was built entirely on control, sharp commands, forced obedience, dragons trained to respond instantly to a rider's will without question. Cadets barked orders at young dragons twice their size, using pressure collars and firm discipline to shape behavior, and the older dragons obeyed, eyes dull with practiced submission. When it came time for Warren's turn, Barrick handed him a training collar and told him to fit it to the largest hatchling. Warren looked at the collar, then at the hatchling watching him with wide golden eyes, and set it down on the ground. I'm not putting that on him. Barrick's face went red. Every rider in this academy uses the collar in the first month. It is tradition. Back home, Warren said evenly, we don't force livestock into anything. Spook an animal once with rough handling, and you spend a year rebuilding the trust you broke in a second. I'm not doing that to them. The yard went quiet. Barrick looked ready to argue further, but Colonel Okafor, standing near the fence with arms crossed, gave a small shake of her head. Barrick swallowed his anger and moved on, muttering something about farmers who thought they knew better than 1,000 years of imperial training. Warren spent that first week mostly ignored by the instructors, left to work in the corner of the yard while cadets trained under Barrick's shouted commands. He did not mind. He fell back on the only method he actually knew, the same one that had worked on stubborn draft animals and skittish farm dogs his whole life. He fed the hatchlings by hand, spoke to them in a low, steady voice, let them explore at their own pace, and rewarded calm behavior instead of punishing fear. At first, nothing seemed to happen. The hatchlings stayed close to him, wary of the noise and rigid schedule around them, growing slower than the other cadets' dragons, who quickly learned to fly short distances and follow shouted commands. Warren caught the cadets snickering more than once, calling his corner of the yard the farm pen. Then, in the second week, something shifted. While training a young hatchling to trust flight for the first time, one of the noble cadets nearby lost control of his own dragon during a forced dive, the animal panicking under too much pressure and crashing hard into the practice wall. Instructors rushed over, more concerned with the cadet's embarrassment than the injured creature whimpering on the ground. Warren crossed the yard without thinking and knelt beside the injured dragon, speaking softly, running a steady hand along its trembling side the way he would calm a spooked animal back home. Within minutes, the dragon's panicked breathing slowed. It let him check its wing without struggling, something it had refused to allow even its own rider to do. The yard had gone quiet again, but this time it was different. Cadets watched him with something less like mockery and more like confusion, unsure what to make of a farmer who had just calmed a dragon their own trained instructors could not settle. From that day, Warren's hatchlings began to change. Freed from fear and pressure, they grew rapidly, faster and stronger than the Academy's records showed for any previous clutch. They began displaying behavior no instructor had ever documented, coordinating movements between each other without any command at all, almost as if they shared a single thought between 6 bodies. One hatchling learned to open a locked feed door by watching Warren do it once. Another began mimicking the shapes of letters Warren traced in the dirt while resting, as if trying to learn to read. Word spread quickly through the academy. A few curious cadets began drifting toward Warren's corner of the yard during free hours, quietly asking questions about his methods, careful not to be seen doing so by Barrick. Colonel Okafor said little during these weeks, but Warren noticed she watched him more closely than she watched anyone else in the academy, her expression unreadable, her notes growing thicker every time she stepped away from the training yard. One evening, as Warren cleaned dirt from beneath his nails and the hatchlings settled into a loose pile beside him, Okafor approached, arms still crossed, studying the 6 creatures resting peacefully in a way she had never seen from any bonded dragon in her years of service. "You're not what the Empire expected," she said finally. Warren shrugged, too tired to think much of it. "Wasn't what I expected either." Okafor said nothing more, but as she walked away, Warren caught her glancing back once, and for the first time since the ceremony, he thought he saw something like respect in her eyes instead of suspicion. 3 months into training, the hatchlings stopped looking like hatchlings at all. What had once been small, unsteady creatures now stood taller than most adult dragons in the academy, their golden scales deepening into a rich bronze that seemed to catch light even in shadow. Warren had grown used to the stairs, though he never quite got comfortable with them. The change that worried the Empire most, however, was not their size. It happened first during a routine flight exercise. One of the 6, the smallest of the clutch, folded her wings mid-air and simply vanished, reappearing several feet away in a shimmer of golden light, startling both instructors and cadets watching from the ground. Reports flooded into the ceremonial order within the hour. Scholars dug through ancient texts long dismissed as myth, texts describing the Empire's first dragons, creatures said to bend light, share thought, and move faster than sight itself, abilities the Empire had assumed extinct for centuries. Warren had no explanation for any of it beyond the obvious. "I just fed them, talked to them, and let them grow up feeling safe," he told the panel of scholars who summoned him for questioning. "I didn't teach them to disappear." The scholars did not seem to know what to do with an answer that simple. Interest in Warren shifted overnight from mockery to obsession. Some scholars wanted to study his methods formally, recording every interaction between him and the hatchlings. Others, quieter and more dangerous, began suggesting the bloodline was too valuable to remain with an untrained outsider, regardless of what the ceremony had shown. Chief among these was Commander Aldrich Van, one of the 7 champions humiliated at the original hatching, a man who had spent 3 months quietly rebuilding his reputation while watching Warren's rise with growing resentment. Van began appearing at Academy events with increasing frequency, always polite in public, always cold when Warren was near. The Sabotage started small. A feed shipment meant for the hatchlings arrived spoiled, forcing Warren to spend an entire night searching the Academy grounds for safe alternatives while the dragons went hungry. A training harness Warren had built himself, carefully fitted to avoid pressure points that might frighten the dragons, went missing the morning of a scheduled evaluation, replaced with a standard imperial collar he refused to use. Rumors began circulating among the nobles that Warren had been caught mistreating the hatchlings, whispers with no evidence behind them, yet spreading fast enough that several officials began quietly questioning whether the farming methods being praised were truly as gentle as they appeared. Everything came to a head during the Academy's public evaluation. an event held twice a year where cadets demonstrated their dragons training in front of visiting nobles and imperial press. Ven had personally arranged for Warren to be scheduled last. After hours of exhausting waiting in the sun with no food provided, a detail buried in scheduling paperwork that no one thought to question. By the time Warren was called into the arena, both he and the hatchlings were exhausted, hungry, and on edge, exactly the conditions Ven had hoped for. Whispers ran through the crowd as Warren walked out, noble faces already smug with anticipated failure. The evaluation required a coordinated flight and response drill, precise commands executed under pressure. Warren, drained and worried more about his dragon's well-being than the exercise itself, gave the first signal. Nothing happened the way it was supposed to. Instead of following individual commands like every other cadet's dragon, the 6 hatchlings moved as one, weaving through the arena in impossible formations no instructor had taught them, anticipating each other's positions without any signal at all. When a support beam Ven had quietly ordered weakened beforehand gave way above the seating section, sending debris toward a group of terrified spectators, the hatchlings did not wait for a command. They moved together instantly, 3 catching the falling debris midair with practiced coordination, the other 3 forming a shield above the crowd below, their new light-bending ability scattering the debris harmlessly into empty air. The entire arena fell silent, then erupted into stunned applause, the intended humiliation twisting completely into something the Empire could not have staged if it tried. Colonel Okafor, watching from the officer's platform, had seen enough. She had spent months quietly documenting the tampered equipment, the spoiled feed, the buried scheduling change, pieces she had assumed were bureaucratic accidents until tonight made the pattern impossible to ignore. After the crowd dispersed, Okafor found Warren checking each hatchling for injuries, his exhaustion plain despite the arena's applause still echoing outside. She said nothing about the collapsed beam or the sabotage, not yet, only knelt beside him and helped inspect the dragon's wings in silence. "You knew this evaluation was rigged against you," she finally said. "Figured something was wrong," Warren admitted, running a tired hand over one hatchling's neck. "Didn't expect it to nearly hurt people in the stands." Okafor's jaw tightened. "It won't happen again. I have proof now, enough to bring formal charges once the right moment comes." She paused, studying him carefully. "For what it's worth, Farmer, I don't think the Empire has any idea what it actually found the night those eggs hatched." Warren looked at his 6 dragons, calm now despite the chaos of the evening, resting close around him the way they always did. "Neither do I," he admitted quietly. "But I think we're starting to find out." Above them, storm clouds rolled slowly over the Academy towers, and somewhere in the capital, Commander Ven was already planning his next move, one far more dangerous than spoiled feed and missing equipment. The formal challenge arrived by messenger drone on a quiet morning, sealed with the crimson wax of Commander Ven's household, delivered directly to the Academy's main hall where nobles and cadets alike gathered to watch Warren read it. Public humiliation, it seemed, was becoming a habit of the Empire's elite. The letter invoked an ancient rite rarely used in living memory, the Writer's Challenge, a formal duel meant to settle disputes over bonded bloodlines when a bond's legitimacy was questioned. Ven claimed, with careful legal wording drafted by expensive advisors, that a bond formed through mistake or manipulation could still be contested through combat, and that the old bloodline deserved a rider proven in battle, not a farmer who had simply been standing in the wrong place at the right time. Imperial law was clear on the consequences of refusal. If Warren declined the challenge, the hatchlings would be reassigned to Ven immediately. No trial, no further debate. Refusing was not truly an option at all. "He's counting on you having no combat training," Okafor said later that day, spreading old dueling records across a table in her private office while the hatchlings rested in the courtyard outside. "Ven has fought in 3 border campaigns. He knows exactly how to force a young dragon into unfamiliar dominance patterns, break their coordination, and win quickly." Warren studied the diagrams without much understanding, feeling every bit the farmer he still considered himself to be. "So I lose." "Not necessarily." Okafor tapped one of the old records, an account of a duel centuries old, long forgotten by most instructors at the Academy. Every recorded writer's challenge assumes both sides use command and dominance to control their dragons. That's how the Empire has always fought these duels. But your hatchlings don't respond to dominance. They never have. Warren thought of the debris in the arena, of 6 dragons moving as one without a single command spoken aloud. Slowly, an idea began to take shape. The days leading up to the challenge passed quickly. Warren spent them not drilling forced maneuvers, but simply working alongside his dragons the way he always had, reinforcing the quiet trust built over months rather than trying to force new tricks under pressure. Okafor helped where she could, though she admitted freely she had little advice to offer for a method she had never seen used before. The morning of the duel, the arena filled beyond capacity, word of the challenge having spread across the capital and beyond. Commander Vin arrived in gleaming ceremonial armor astride his war dragon, a massive scarred beast bred for decades of controlled aggression, easily twice the size of any single hatchling Warren commanded. Warren arrived in his usual plain work clothes. Hatchlings gathered close around him, drawing a mixture of laughter and confused murmurs from the crowd. The duel began with a signal horn, and Vin's dragon surged forward immediately, using its size and raw power to press an early advantage, exactly as the old records predicted. Warren's hatchlings scattered instinctively, avoiding the first crushing strike, circling wide around the larger beast. Vin barked sharp commands, forcing his dragon through aggressive dives and sweeping attacks meant to isolate and overwhelm one hatchling at a time. For several tense minutes, it seemed to work. One hatchling took a glancing blow to the wing, tumbling hard into the sand before recovering, and the crowd gasped, sensing an early end to the fight. But Warren gave no commands at all. Instead, he simply watched, trusting the bond built over months of patience rather than control. The hatchlings, freed from the burden of waiting on instructions, began doing what they had always done best together, moving as a single coordinated mind rather than 6 separate creatures following orders. Where Vin's dragon struck one, the others closed the gap instantly, covering weaknesses before Vin could even register them. Frustrated, Vin pushed harder, forcing his war dragon into increasingly aggressive maneuvers, each command sharper and more desperate than the last. The dragon, exhausted from being driven past its natural limits, began to slow, its movements growing sloppy under the strain of constant forced dominance. The hatchlings, rested and coordinated, found their opening. 3 of them dove together, drawing Vin's dragon into a wide turn, while the remaining 3 used their light-bending ability to blur their positions, confusing the war dragon's exhausted senses completely. In the confusion, the largest hatchling closed in and wrapped gently but firmly around the war dragon's neck, not to harm it, but simply to hold it still, ending the duel without a single serious injury on either side. The horn sounded. The challenge was over. Vin sat frozen atop his exhausted dragon, staring in disbelief as the crowd around him fell into stunned silence, then slowly began to murmur, then cheer, a swelling wave of noise that grew louder with every passing second. He had come expecting to expose a farmer's weakness in front of the entire empire. Instead, he had exposed the limits of everything the empire's rigid training had ever taught. Warren crossed the sand immediately, ignoring the cheering crowd entirely, and knelt beside Vin's dragon, checking its trembling sides for injury the same way he had checked every dragon at the academy since his first week there. The great war dragon, still shaking from exhaustion, allowed the gentle inspection without resistance, letting out a low, tired breath as Warren ran a steady hand along its neck. Vin dismounted slowly, his expression unreadable, watching the man he had tried to destroy tend carefully to his own defeated dragon instead of celebrating the victory. "Why?" Vin asked quietly, the arena's roar fading into background noise around them. "Would you help him? You won. I lost. This is exactly what you wanted." Warren did not look up from the dragon's trembling side. "I never wanted to win anything," he said simply. "I just wanted them safe. All of them, yours included." Somewhere above the arena, Colonel Okafor watched the exchange with quiet satisfaction, already knowing this moment would be remembered far longer than the duel itself. News of the duel spread across the empire faster than any official announcement could keep up with. By the following morning, Hollow broadcasts across a dozen worlds carried the same image on repeat. A plain farmer kneeling in the sand beside the dragon of the man who had just tried to destroy him, checking its wounds with the same gentle care he gave his own bonded creatures. It was not the victory that people talked about most. It was the mercy. In the days that followed, something shifted quietly across the empire, starting small and spreading outward the way water finds every crack in dry ground. Common workers on distant colonies, farmers and dockhands and miners who had never expected to see themselves reflected in anything the imperial court did, began speaking Warren's name with a kind of pride previously reserved for nobles and champions. Children on farming worlds started drawing pictures of 6 dragons circling a man in plain work clothes, taping them to walls in one-room schoolhouses light years from Solvang. The ceremonial order, sensing the shifting mood, moved quickly to address what scholars had spent months quietly researching. In a formal address held in the same grand hall where the hatching ceremony had taken place, the head priestess stood before a crowd far larger than the one that had witnessed Warren's arrival months earlier. "For generations," she said, her voice carrying easily through the silent hall, "the Empire believed the old bloodline chose strength, power, lineage worthy of command." She paused, letting the silence stretch. "We were wrong. The old records, buried and mistranslated for centuries, speak plainly once properly understood. The bloodline was never meant to choose power. It was meant to choose character. We simply stopped looking for it, certain that birth alone could produce what only patience and honesty ever could." Warren, standing quietly near the back of the hall with his hatchlings gathered close behind him, felt distinctly out of place among the nobles turning to look at him with newfound respect. He still was not entirely sure what to do with attention he had never asked for. Colonel Okafor found him afterward in the academy's quiet courtyard. The hatchlings sprawled lazily in patches of afternoon sun, while Warren mended a torn strap on one of his simple leather harnesses, the same kind he had built with his own hands months earlier. "The Emperor's Council wants to formalize new training standards," she said, settling onto the bench beside him without ceremony. "Based on your methods. They're calling it a full reform of the Academy's approach." Warren kept his eyes on the strap in his hands. "I'm not a teacher." "No," Okafor agreed. "But you're the only rider in this empire's history that 6 dragons chose freely and kept choosing every single day since. Through sabotage, through a duel, through everything Vin and men like him threw at you." She paused. "That matters more than you seem to realize. Commander Vin's fall from grace, once the sabotage was formally exposed through Okafor's careful documentation, came swiftly and without much sympathy from the nobles who had once celebrated him. Stripped of rank and standing trial for endangering spectators through the tampered support beam, he faded quickly from public relevance, a quiet cautionary tale whispered among cadets about pride and dominance failing where patience had succeeded. Warren, for his part, had no interest in taking Vin's old position or any title the grateful nobles tried repeatedly to offer him. He agreed only to help reshape the Academy's early training, working alongside Okafor to blend the discipline the Empire valued with the trust-based patience that had raised his 6 hatchlings into something the old records called truly bonded, rather than simply obedient. Months passed. The Academy's training yard slowly changed under their combined effort. Harsh collars replaced with the same simple techniques Warren had used from the beginning, cadets learning to listen to their dragons rather than command them into silence. Progress was slow, and plenty of old instructors like Barrick grumbled through the transition, but results spoke louder than tradition. Dragons trained under the new methods grew stronger, more coordinated, and far less prone to the panic and injury that had once been considered simply part of the process. One evening, as autumn settled over the capital and the training yard emptied for the night, Warren stood alone in the open field behind the academy, watching his 6 dragons, now fully grown, circle lazily overhead in the fading light. They moved together the way they always had, 6 bodies acting as one, a bond built not through force or bloodline alone, but through months of quiet patience neither the Empire nor Warren himself had fully understood at the time. A group of new cadets lingered nearby at the edge of the field, watching Warren the way students often watched him now, careful and curious, notebooks in hand, hoping to catch some hint of a method they still struggled to fully grasp. Warren noticed them but said nothing grand, offered no dramatic speech about destiny or bloodlines, or the old prophecy scholars still debated in dusty archive halls. He simply knelt, ran a steady hand along the largest dragon's neck as it landed beside him, and continued the quiet, ordinary work he had always known, the same work he had done his whole life before an empire ever knew his name. Somewhere far above Solvane, the stars were just beginning to appear, and Warren Doyle, farmer, reluctant rider, guardian of a bloodline older than the empire itself, felt for the first time in months that he finally understood exactly where he belonged.